The purpose of this video is to introduce you to computer hardware and how that actually all gets put inside a computer to make it connect together and fully operate. Let's get started. So first off, there are a lot of different components in a computer, and we've been going over them today in Code Day. So you should have a basic understanding of what all of these do. Of the components on this table, I'll go left to right. We have the case on the left-hand side. Next to that, in the small gray box that said Verizon, that is the central processing unit. Then we have the Wi-Fi card, the power supply unit, the solid-state drive in the black and white box. Underneath that, we have the CPU fan. Above that, we have the hard drive. Next to that, we have the RAM. And that black and red box in the back, that's the motherboard. And then the graphics processing unit is on the right. So let's get started. You can open up the case and see that it's pretty empty inside. There's some cables that hook it up to between the motherboard and also the onboard fans, the power buttons on the case, things like that. But this is where everything will go. The first thing you do is mount the motherboard in the case. And let's take a look at the motherboard. It comes in a box with a silver bag around it, and that bag is called the anti-static bag, referring to static electricity there. And so that bag just makes sure that static electricity doesn't get inside the motherboard and cause things to short circuit and ruin the board if current and electricity go where you don't want them to. So everything, all of the electrical components will come in a bag similar to that. The first thing I'm going to do is show you guys the different aspects of the motherboard. We have the input-output panel, and that's going to be facing out the back of the computer. And that's where all your USB ports will go, your audio jacks and things like that, anything that needs to be hooked up from external to the computer. Then we have the CPU chipset, and that's where the CPU will go. Next to that, we have those long black slots next to it. Those are those RAM slots. That's where your sticks of RAM will go. And you can see I have 4 on this motherboard, but I'm only going to be using 2 of them. Then we also have slots for the graphics processing unit. We have places where you can plug in the hard drive and the solid state drive, and then there are also places around the board for plugging in any of the case hardware, so those fans and the power buttons, those will all hook up somewhere on the motherboard. The first thing we'll look at is the central processing unit, and mine happens to come from a company called AMD. There's another one called Intel, which you guys should be familiar with, and they are both the large CPU manufacturers. And on the back, you can see that has lots of gold pins, and that's what's going into the CPU chipset. And it's connecting the motherboard to the different processing units inside the CPU. So that goes into the chipset. Next up, we will install the cooling fan on top of the chipset, and that keeps the CPU nice and cool. Once that's up and running and we connect that up to the motherboard electronically, then we'll go ahead and install the RAM, random access memory, and that's going to go stick into the slots next to the CPU. And at this point, we have a fully operational computer. You actually don't need anything else here. In my case, I have a separate graphics processing unit, and I'm going to install that now. And there's just a slot on the motherboard where that sticks in. And the graphics processing unit helps out with controlling what's output to a screen. And it's so large because it requires a lot of cooling to maintain an optimal operation there. Next up, we'll go over the Wi-Fi chip, and the Wi-Fi chip actually inserts into the motherboard and routes out to antenna out the back of the case. And you can have different versions of this. Sometimes you don't have antenna and it works a different way, but mine has antenna, and those will go out the back of the case. Next up, let's take a look at the hard drive and solid state drive, and these are the memory other than random access memory, so these are more long-term. The hard drive is actually stored on the case and has a wire hooking it up to the motherboard, and then the solid state drive can actually be plugged straight into the motherboard. The last thing you need to do is hook up the power supply unit, which is stored, in my case, on the bottom, and those wires will route up into the main body of the case where you can connect them to the motherboard, and there's a separate cable going to graphics processing, separate cables going to any hard drives that you have, and this divides power out among the components. Once you have everything hooked up appropriately, then you can go ahead and close the case, turn on the power, and see if your computer works.